Hi! In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how to create and use multi-sample instruments on the Digitakt. Now, why would we want to do that? And what does multi-sample means? Simply put, when we play a note, say a C4, we'll hear a different sample depending on some conditions. Traditionally, multi-sample instruments will react to MIDI velocity, having a number of velocity layers in which playing softer or harder will result in different samples being triggered. We can also have different samples for different octaves, for example, since pitching a sample up or down will change the character of the sound, and thus, having samples covering different note ranges will result in more natural sounding instruments. You can apply both of these approaches simultaneously, of course. Having a sample per note on a keyboard with different loudness will give us the best possible quality. This is why high-quality instrument sample libraries are massive in size. To the best of my knowledge, we can't quite do either of these approaches on the Digitakt. And given the limited memory we have available, we probably wouldn't want to anyway. What we can do is to play different samples every time a note is triggered. You see, when a performer plays an instrument, no matter how proficient, a drummer will never hit the snare with exactly the same strength. And a guitarist will plug in a slightly different string position, creating small variations of timbre and loudness. Today, we're going to learn how to apply this concept for better humanization of our sequences. Let's take a look at a practical example. The effect can be quite subtle, but it really adds up in my opinion. Hi-hats greatly benefit from multisampling since they are typically used for playing repeating patterns that can get repetitive if we are not being careful. Here's how it sounds with multisampling. And here, with a single sample per step. Can you hear the difference? Note that we are only changing the sound of the sample. A human performer will also never play exactly on time. And currently we are playing the hats on the grid. We can add more variation by p-locking a small amount of microtiming and slight velocity adjustments. Or better yet, just play the hats by hand in a keyboard or pad. Note that this technique is not limited to drum sounds. I actually put together on my Patreon a small sample pack with a number of other instruments, including pianos, a kalimba, a glockenspiel, and many others, as well as a few drum kits. The download includes the samples, demo projects, and some cool sounds if applicable. Let's take a look at how do we use these samples, and later we'll cover how to create our own multi-sample sounds from scratch. I found two methods for creating multi-sampled instruments on the Digitakt, and each had some advantages and some disadvantages. Here's the first project. I'm going to get rid of all the default samples, since we don't need them right now. For the first method, we need to load samples in consecutive slots. Add this upright piano sample from Pianotech, and we are going to load all C5 samples into the first 4 sample slots. And select the slot 3 for this track. On the amp section, I'm going to add a tiny bit of attack to avoid clicks and pops and set up an infinite release so that we can hear the entire sample playing. Feel free to adjust this to taste, of course. On the LFO page, set up the mode to hold, destination to sample slot, and wave to random. Now adjust the amount to around 1.95. Now every time that we trigger a note, one of these 4 samples will be chosen at random. Note that the LFO is bipolar. Values between 0 and 0.99 will trigger the selected sample, in this case slot 3. Between 0 and -1, the previous one, slot 2. We have 4 samples, so a depth value of 1.99 will trigger all 4 of them. You want to avoid using a value of 2, since it will normally work, but then when the random value is exactly 2.0, it will select slot 5 in this case. Keeping this in mind, you can choose to use any number of samples you want for this effect, give it a is divisible by 2 and adjust the depth to match. If you have any way of splitting MIDI notes into different MIDI channels, like with the RetroKit's RK002 smart cable, or my own custom firmware for the Novation Launchpad Pro, links to both of these in the description, we can just copy the sound to all the other tracks, and now you have a multi-sample polyphonic piano on your Digitakt. The first method will work with all 4 machines currently available on the Digitakt. The second method uses the same concept, but with the slice machine. Here I'm using the Steinway C5 piano samples, once again sampled from Pianotech. We select the slice machine, a grid of 4, and the third slice slot. Adjust the amp attack and decay, and set up the LFO as we did before, only this time we choose slice slot instead of sample slot. For this to work, all 4 samples have to be the exact same length individually, but the total sample length can be as long or as short as you want, taking into account the Digitakt limitations, of course. And that's it, simple as that. Why would we choose one method over another? I personally prefer method 2 since I can more easily manage my sample slots, and more importantly, I can save the sound so that it can always be easily recalled in different projects from the sound pool. Method 1, however, allows us to use samples of different lengths, different machines for pitch shifting, but it requires us to manage our sample slots in a project to have the samples right next to each other, which might not always be possible. And because of this, we can't save the instruments in our sound pool unless we recreate the sample slot structure, which is a mess to do. Another thing to consider is that because method 2 bundles all the sounds in a single sample, we can hit a limitation in the Digitakt's 33-second sample duration. Not a problem for kick or snare sounds, but if we want to have multiple cymbal sounds and preserve the entire decay tail, we'll easily go over that number. There's another issue, however, particularly with the slice machine method, is that despite adding attack to our sample envelope, pops and clicks might sometimes occur. It seems the click can happen when changing the slice when the sound is playing. This doesn't crossfade, as it happens when triggering the same note in other machines. This does seem like a bug, however. We'll have to see if in the future this gets addressed, but if not, the first method works just as well, despite the previously discussed shortcomings. Now we're going to take a look at how to prepare the samples for these methods. You can technically do this on the Digitakt itself, but for this demo, we're going to hop into the DAW, where we will be sampling this lovely kalimba and a VST instrument. The first thing I'm going to do is to set up the tempo to 120 BPM and make a marker annotation on the 33-second mark. This is not strictly necessary, and the Digitakt can handle samples longer than 33 seconds if they are being loaded from the computer. But I like to have a reference and try not to make the samples overly long. Keep in mind the memory limitations, but if you need to save space, you can use the old trick of pitch up, pitch down, which I'm not gonna cover here. The 120 BPM will give us 16.5 bars to work with. You don't have to stick to the bars, but it helps when trimming samples on the grid. Since the kalimba is an acoustic instrument, I'm going to use the microphone to record the sounds for each note independently, at least 4 times. For this demonstration, we're only going to sample a C, making sure we don't cut the sample tails. I'm trying to use the same force and articulation every time. But I will not achieve a perfect match, and this is okay. By consolidating each clip, we can quickly normalize each note to 0 dB. But you can also keep volume variations if you want. It will add to the humanization. Once everything is recorded, I will throw a tuner to the track and make sure everything is in tune, adjusting the clips as needed. We now can group all the clips so they are equally spaced. And that's it. We can export it. I will use a normalized mono 48 kHz 16-bit WAV file. And we're done. You can now send this sample to the Digitakt and start playing with it. Now let's sample some more piano sounds from Pianotech. I'm using the demo version here. This way, everyone should be able to follow along. I want to capture a soft piano sound with medium to low velocities. I'll start by setting up a MIDI file with 4 notes, each with slightly different velocity. You probably want to keep the velocities similar enough that the sounds are not dramatically different. But if that's what you're looking for, go for it. There are no rules here. Pianotech has 127 velocity layers and doesn't use sampling. Instead, it generates sound using complex physical modeling algorithms, which makes it an interesting candidate for our purposes. I like to throw in a spectrum device on the MIDI track to check details and make sure the volume goes below -80, -90 dBs before triggering the next note. You could directly export this, but I like to either resample or freeze and flatten to check the audio clips and add adjustments if needed. Multisample instruments can be pretty nice, but what are the drawbacks? The most obvious is the space, both in disk and in RAM. Especially the latter, the Digitakt only has a tiny 64 MB of RAM available for samples, about 11 minutes of audio. Of course, there are ways around this limitation, like having a dedicated project for creating drum loops, say a 32-step drum pattern, and use resampling to create lighter samples that then we can load in more complex projects or sets. Personally, I haven't found many issues with my workflow, since I tend to create self-contained projects and rarely fill up the RAM. Sometimes I just use the Digitakt as a simple drum machine. And other times I split the difference, using 4 or 5 tracks for the drums and the rest for melodic elements. Remember that you can download the samples, sounds and projects on my Patreon, and if you wish to support me further, you can check the links in the description. I hope this was helpful, and please do let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Until next time.